Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by my dice rolling CRPG enjoying co-host Tucker Hazel. And we're here to talk about Baldur's Gate 3, particularly through the paradigm of the Game Awards, because this is installment 2 of our 6-installment series, talking about all the games nominated at old Jeff Keighley's show this year for Game of the Year. We already did Alan Wake, now we're doing Baldur's Gate. And this will be an interesting one because, again, I put enjoy in quotation marks for Tucker, and I never played Baldur's Gate. So how's this going to go?
Yeah,
we'll find out in a second. But before we do, if you want to talk to us about Baldur's Gate, or if you want to hang out on the night of the awards show and chat with us about the new trailer for Metroid Prime 4 that we're going to see, join our Discord.
Sure.
Like as usual, top of the description down there. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, leave a comment. The trailer for Metroid Prime 4 will be the reveal of Cranky Kong.
Holy shit, really? Wow. And hey, that makes sense. It is retro after all. They have a model of Cranky Kong in their fucking file somewhere.
And there's precedent for Cranky Kong showing up at the Game Awards, so it just sort of makes logical sense.
More than most Nintendo characters have.
But,
yeah?
True. Tucker, speaking of Cranky Kong, let's talk about video games. Principally, let's talk about Baldur's Gate 3, and let's go through each category that's been nominated for and talk about what we think its chances are in that respective category. And I think in the case of this game, have kind of a larger conversation about what is a pretty interesting narrative around this game.
No, absolutely. And that's kind of the point of this video for us, is we're not passionate about this game. As I described to Abram before, under the assumption this game takes between 100 and 120 hours to finish, of the combined 200 to 240 hours that would be required for the two of us to have finished this game, we've collectively played 7. And they were all me.
Yeah, collectively is not a great word to use there, because I never touched the game.
Technically, true.
That's fair enough. I actually watched you play it for a little bit, and I was like, there is no... Yeah, there's no planet or planetoid.
Sure.
That
just in case we're on
upon
Pluto.
which...
No, that's a dwarf planet.
Right. A dwarf planet.
What's the difference between a planetoid and a dwarf planet? I don't know.
I think a planetoid is from Mario Galaxy.
No, but it's got... I digress. Tanner... No, you're not Tanner. You're someone else. You're Abram. Abram, where do we start for this? Do we start... Oh, we start with Game of the Year. I forgot we said that in the other video. Yeah. We start with Game of the Year. The Game Award nominees for Game of the Year in Year of Our Lord 2023 are Alan Wake 2, which we already done a video about, Baldur's Gate 3, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Marvel Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Abram, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 is winning Game of the Year. And this is maybe the most interesting thing to talk about here, right? Because when Tears of the Kingdom came out, essentially, I think it's fair to say that basically everybody presupposed that Zelda was going to win the award again and be, in fact, check me on this, Mr. Awards man, the only game and its immediate follow-up to ever win Game of the... Oh, unless, did Last of Us do that? Did Last of Us win in 2013?
The Keighley Game of the Year Awards did not exist then, so... Yeah,
but the Spike... It won the Spike one?
Oof. Well, we'll find out.
Well, the point is, it would have been quite interesting to see Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom both take their years.
No, GTA 5 won, which
okay. Yeah. Oh, of course that makes sense. So it would have been unprecedented, and that would have been quite interesting. But then this little goofy guy Larian Studios pops up on the scene. And Baldur's Gate 3, I think, just caught fire in a way that I completely wrote off. I had been saying for a long time that Zelda's going to win. Baldur's Gate 3 is too niche. It doesn't have the momentum. There's too many people frustrated with its dice rolls, or not interested in CRPGs, or didn't play it because it's just hanging out on PC. It doesn't really matter. It's critical darling, but doesn't have the sort of base of support and industry-wide acclaim of Zelda. But I think that that's been pretty patently disproven over the coming months. Not only as it's come to consoles, but also just continued to gain momentum and start winning precursors.
In the lightest sense.
At the Golden Joystick. I would say that a Baldur's Gate Game of the Year win and sweep are pretty much a foregone conclusion. But I don't know if I know exactly your thought process on this point.
My thought process is it's more likely than not. I'd say it's the safer prediction to err on the side of momentum and narrative to say that Baldur's Gate 3 will probably take home the Game of the Year award and certainly be deserving of that in terms of how the general consensus of this game has been forming over the past couple months, and it being a surprise and bringing a new flavor of game design to the Game of the Year conversation is, I mean, phenomenal for that game, for that team, for the general oeuvre of Game of the Year nominees and stuff. But I am still of the mind that Zelda still has a very, very solid shot, and I think people are running it off a little too hard. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in specific when we get to our Tears of the Kingdom video. But
sure,
to me, it is the safer pick to go with Baldur's Gate 3 because when you're predicting these kind of things, you want to go with the momentum in the current narrative because that's the best information you have to work with. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion the way that you do. But as this game has gained so much popularity, and some of my friends who I don't know if they were into this kind of game beforehand have dove into it and played a lot of it, and almost across the board loved it quite a bit. Excuse me. This was the holdout for me. I had played basically every other game that was in Game of the Year conversation outside of Sea of Stars. That's the one I really haven't touched at all, and I don't need to anymore because it's not nominated for Game of the Year at Game Awards. But just before it was nominated, I started playing Baldur's Gate 3, and I did play 7 hours of it, which is frankly longer than most of the games I've played this year, but very short for the amount of time that you need to put into this game to truly appreciate it. But the unfortunate thing is that I have to wrestle with reality and my brain when it comes to discussing this game in the Game of the Year conversation, because this is like so far and away my least favorite of these 6 games. Like it's a different stratosphere below them. Just because the other 5 games are 5 of my favorite games ever made, and Baldur's Gate 3 is an okay game that other people like that I found to be kind of grating and boring.
Yeah, would you say this is probably the only one you'd hold a negative opinion
I don't hold a negative opinion of this game. I hold a negative opinion of certain elements of this game. I think it is a good game, but as this is something we've kind of talked a little bit about recently, this is a game that is not for me. I recognize its quality. I think I have a relatively good leg to stand on when I'm expressing my criticisms of it, as we'll get to when we talk about some of the other categories. But I'm so far in the Baldur's Gate 3 minority that I'm like, I know this is just a taste thing and not like a super specific, this is a bad game take for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because CRPGs are extremely niche. And, you know, there's no shortage of games basically every year that are for a very, very small group of people that are very, very acclaimed but don't get any traction, right? I mean, there is that, I will never pull the name out in a million years, but there's a very, very highly acclaimed anime Switch game that has like a 97 or something.
Jack John?
That I remember people...
that is a Switch game with like a 96 on Rotten Tomatoes,
It could be. It's just a game of very high acclaim, but obviously no real momentum. But Baldur's Gate found it. And it's interesting, right? Because, and I was just fact-checking myself on this, Baldur's Gate was first available in early access in 2020. But the game, again, talking from a very more mainstream perspective, which is where we're both sitting in relation to this game in particular...
Yeah,
pretty much.
Because this is the honest to God truth, and this is why I'm so excited to have this conversation. This is basically the only time we've ever talked in depth about a game that neither of us have a lot of experience with. Usually, we talk about games that we've played or completed most of the time, but had a conversation about a game that's not in our wheelhouse, and I think that's very exciting. And it's primarily for Baldur's Gate being something outside of the traditionally hardcore gamer wheelhouse that is now in that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that that's ultimately really, really cool. And you have to kind of look at there being a confluence of factors here. And frankly, this is going to be a very inexhaustive list, just because again, I'm not in this portion of the games community to fully understand it. But Larian as an independent game developer, bringing the IP of Baldur's Gate back. Of course, Baldur's Gate in the universe of Dungeons and Dragons, coming out with this
by the way, I
game
didn't
with a
actually
fucking
know. It took me talking to Sam about him playing it and kind of pitching me playing it as, hey, we're gonna maybe think about starting a D&D campaign in like the next 5 to 20,000 months. And he's like,
Yeah.
but if you play Baldur's Gate 3 as a Dungeons and Dragons game, you'll get used to it. I'm like, hold on. This is a Dungeons and Dragons game? Because that's not... Yeah. I wouldn't say that's particularly obvious to the outside of Dungeons and Dragons, outside of Baldur's Gate, outside of CRPG world. Like, I watched trailers for this game, but I don't... Obviously, they went one year out of the other because it's not the kind of game I was interested in.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that, which makes this a bigger deal for especially Dungeons and Dragons than close to almost anything for that IP.
Well, this would also be... Would this be the first licensed game to win Game of the Year?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Unless we go back to the Spike days and like Arkham City.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which is maybe the only one I could think of, because obviously Hogwarts Legacy was nominated for nothing. The Respawn
Walking Dead
Star Wars games
won in 2012.
Yeah. Fair enough. Interesting. But it is pretty compelling from that lens, but obviously this game was also adopted quite heavily by people as sort of an archetype for what AAA game dev can be in terms of being content complete, in terms of working, in terms of not having, expansions to buy and all this stuff. Basically, what I'm trying to beat around the bush of is the game became co-opted by a lot of really shitty, fucking dumb grifters online that I don't like. But that's a different conversation. But I think, frankly, part of Baldur's Gate's momentum is that it became, in some ways, quite polarizing on a number of different avenues. This was a big conversation that certain people began and game devs jumped in on and opened a discourse. But also something as simple as save scumming in the game became a big conversation. It felt like Baldur's Gate... The people generating headlines, the people sort of steering larger conversation, had a vested interest in many facets of the game, which was, I think, quite critical in keeping it going over the months and keeping it in everybody's mind. Because, again, this is a sort of game that you would expect is going to review very highly, be spoken about by an in-group, and then disappear. But it kept, I think, reinventing itself in larger games conversation. It kept making the right headlines, which put more eyes on that console release and got more people who matter. And I mean that solely in terms of people who can vote and get a game like this nominated. Get more people into the fold, and then we just arrive at this place that we've arrived at. And I had raised a question to you of we've talked about this before, but people out there don't know we have, of whether this would be the least accessible game to ever win an accolade like this, right? And I would say probably yes. We were throwing this or Souls around, and I think Souls is a lot more accessible and also sold a lot better than this. So.
It's interesting because the inaccessibility of it is, I think, the primary reason why the reason I can say that I feel that way about it, that it would be the least accessible, is I had a hard time playing this game. And frankly, as someone who's played thousands of video games in my life, there are very few video games that I pick up a controller and start to play that I don't instinctively know how the mechanics work, how interaction works. My brain has been so trained to understand this kind of item and this kind of hidden secrets and this kind of control and this kind of combat. But Baldur's Gate shares none of those because it's in a genre that is so niche that it has never crossed my experience. I mean, the closest things I've played are like a little bit of Fallout 1, but even then it's like that's pretty different. Or like, like an RTS is maybe kind of similar in terms of pointing and clicking to move your character. But I would consider this an inaccessible game because I had to sit there and just like look at these menus and look at the way you're controlling things and be like, this, as someone who's played thousands of video games, does not make sense to me, which is equally compelling and frustrating as I would love to really get into this game and understand what's so great about its branching storylines and the characters and the world they built and the performances of these voice actors that apparently did such an amazing job, but because it was so outside of my wheelhouse in terms of understanding progress and control and just the general flow of this style of game, I found myself like butting up against my interaction with the game in a way that doesn't happen to me with other games because it's usually just a natural flow state of I know what to expect and I can then just approach the game on its own design level rather than like having to teach myself the game as it's going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because obviously a lot of that is quite foreign, particularly again in our space. The console space might be a better way of framing it than a mainstream space. And I think what's interesting, right, is that looking at Baldur's Gate, it has a lot of the trappings of very successful games, very successful modern games, and an absurd amount of choice and agency. A really great emergent quality that has made this an extremely popular game online to stream and to watch people see where dice rolls and conversations lead them. I think the game invites a lot of, frankly, quite traditional or I guess understandable moments of fun. The same way you watch Video Game Donkey laugh at how he kills moblins in Breath of the Wild is not too different than watching your favorite streamer play Baldur's Gate. So I think that it had that going for it. But then also, and follow me for a moment here, Little Domino, Big Domino meme. Little Domino. Bungie decides to make an MMORPG for consoles. Big Domino. Larian is poised to win Game of the Year. Because I think that Baldur's Gate is again, CRPG. The C is for computer. It was games like Destiny that brought a lot of PC-centric design philosophy to console players and slowly began to turn up the heat to where there's a lot of PC design philosophy in almost all of the AAA Western games we play now.
Rare designs a James Bond game.
Sure.
Larian is poised to win.
Keep making the domino smaller if you want. But things like how Destiny, and again, I don't want to... Destiny is the most mainstream example of the point I'm making. Destiny introducing a UI and a cursor that's a lot closer to a mouse and a PC interface and a console one. That sort of move your little circular cursor around a screen instead of snapping to menu options has become standard in a lot of AAA games. I think over time, console players have become more and more acclimated to these inherently PC like mechanical interactions that have primed the pump for a game like this to be successful. Then obviously you've got things like Disco Elysium that were already popular CRPGs on consoles. So I think this game is really a convergence of a lot of really amazing factors. And for that reason, I think that, again, assuming that it wins, because I am assuming that it wins, I think it marks a very, very interesting and exciting victory, even if it is the game I give the least fuck about personally from the year. It is a cool touchstone for the sort of crossing streams of PC and console gaming. It is a cool kicking in the door of a new genre that can potentially be popularized. Same way that From and Bungie have did that with Destiny and did that with Demon's Souls and things. So I would be quite pleased on like a wider industry level to see the game win, even though I don't really give a shit.
Yeah, and that trend is why this game appeals to me so much as ostensibly a game historian. Where the fuck are you going? Oh, he's letting us cat. I don't know if he can still hear me, I'm gonna be honest. Oh, okay, he can actually. Yeah.
Sorry, I was wanting to just keep talking. I should have signaled that.
There was no, you just left. I'm like, huh. But anyway, why this game appeals to me as a student of the industry, as a game historian, like I like watching moments shift, and like this is definitely a turning point. And what I'm really so interested to see is now that Baldur's Gate 3 has made the CRPG more popular, and especially on console than it ever has been, how this will inform other development teams to make console-focused CRPGs, which of course Baldur's Gate 3 isn't one of those, but I think that those will definitely come. And how that genre can be mixed with other genres to make it more appealing and more accessible to the wider fan base, but still retaining what makes that genre distinct. I'm excited for those games. I'm excited for the Baldur's Gate 3 inspired games 5 to 10 years from now, where a dev team takes the more accessible console-focused approach to menu design and control and combat that Larian never thought really to have in Baldur's Gate 3 because they're focused on making a CRPG-esque CRPG game. But you can see the domino effect continuing where I'm into a CRPG 5 years from now because another dev team was inspired to make one because Baldur's Gate 3 is as popular and as influential as is now, which I think is really, really exciting. You want to get into some of these other categories? Like best game direction. That is the second of 8 categories that this is nominated for. The nominees being Alan Wake 2, developed by Remedy Entertainment, Baldur's Gate 3, Larian Studios, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo EPD, Marvel Spider-Man 2 from Insomniac Games, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, also developed by Nintendo EPD. Now, game direction. What do you think the chances of this winning are?
I think it's extremely high. Yeah, it's ultimately, and I mentioned this in the Alan Wake video, but it's just a matter of the scale upon which Larian executed on this vision. I frankly don't think it's a very complicated category to sort of dissect. None of these games, except for Tears of the Kingdom, and Tears of the Kingdom is, its mastery in physics is different than the mastery of this. And as we get into a narrative, I just think that the number of interlocking systems and the amount of space that Baldur's Gate gives you to get into the story and shape the story is just going to win. I just think that the scale of that achievement is huge.
Absolutely. And I think that this is, if I think it's likely that that Baldur's Gate wins Game of the Year, I think it's more likely that it wins Game Direction, even if Tears of the Kingdom ends up taking Game of the Year, or Alan Wake 2, or any other split that ends up with Game of the Year. I think the safest category for me is Baldur's Gate 3 with Game Direction, because I really do think that it is that complexity that and breadth of possibility that makes this game the wonder to other people that it is, but even a wonder to me, because my favorite element of this game was the fact that I was able to shape these choices, and even through my own small understanding of the mechanics, it flowed with that and created a compelling narrative that was that continued forward and didn't stop me because I was failing checks, or I was failing combat encounters. It continued the story and allowed it to branch into some other direction, that I was sitting here and talking to my friend Sam, who had recently not only beaten the game, but I believe started a second or maybe even third playthrough, that I was telling him, look, so I show up to this area, and the leader of this area is torturing a little girl because she thought the little girl stole from her. And my character is a barbarian, and so she doesn't have a lot of skill in persuasion checks or charisma, stuff like that. So I wasn't able to conversation my way out of having her not kill the kid. So she killed the kid. And then I had to go tell the parents that their kid had died, and then it started this whole riot in the town. And like, this was how the story went for me, is my character is a brute, so she failed to save the kid by talking. I could have attacked, but I didn't. And that created this mini story for me that was pretty compelling, of the fact that I failed to save a child's life. And then I was sitting there with Sam, and he's like, the kid died? What the fuck's wrong with you? And I'm like, that's just how it went. And that was really the only like clear example I have. Actually, that's not true. Abram, you were with me when I did the second interesting moment of emergent storytelling that I did in Baldur's Gate 3, which is rocking up to a goblin camp and trying to talk to this guy. And maybe choosing Barbarian wasn't my best choice, because I kind of like the idea of weaseling my way out of conversations with persuasion. But I can't, because Karlach is a barbarian. She's not great at that. But I was able to not have the goblins attack me by having my character bend down and smear animal poop on her face. And they're like, all right, you put animal poop on your face? You're welcome into the camp. And that is maybe one of the most interesting video game decision moments I've ever made in a video game. It's because there's this breadth, even in the small moments, of like 10 different choices I could have made to have that outcome, get past that gate. But I chose the poop option. And that's the first time I've ever chosen the poop option in a game.
Let's just segue
there's
ahead
evil,
here.
There's neutral, and there's poop.
Because what you're talking about here is really ultimately putting us beautifully into best narrative,
absolutely.
in which Baldur's Gate's up against. Yeah, I mean, Baldur's Gate in Best Narrative is up against Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty, Final Fantasy 16, and Spider-Man 2. I think basically for what you've said here, this is going to win narrative as well. Again, I just think, and we were talking about this in the context of Alan Wake, right? We were talking about how the concept of Alan Wake's narrative and the sort of subversion it provides and the sort of new approaches to storytelling it employs are very cool, but the actual like meat of the narrative is maybe not quite there or a little bit unclear, and probably in that way holds it back from the victory. I think when you look at what you're saying here, this concept of the player agency, emergent gameplay driven narrative,
water cooler moments,
that is all
a difference.
Yeah, it's extremely hot. That's what's hot, right? But then you pair that with, as you've been explaining here, an extremely high level of execution too. I just think that we might as well just rubber stamp the win for Baldur's Gate here and go to the next category,
absolutely.
frankly.
The next one is, frankly, one we can't really talk too much about, which is the score and music.
Yeah.
Everyone who I know that has talked about this says that this is, a phenomenal score, and I yield to them, not because I thought the score was good or bad, but because frankly kind of went in one ear and out the other for me. Which, I mean, I guess it worked great for the moments, but I wasn't remembering any themes necessarily. But I also didn't spend necessarily enough time in the world to like sit with the themes enough to have them be emotionally resonant for me. But I think that this is one that it's less likely to win, because I think that Hi-Fi Rush and Final Fantasy 16 have such strong narratives and fan bases for their scores winning. But Baldur's Gate easily has a solid chance of taking this home, because there are people that are very, very big fans of this score.
And to be clear, the other games nominated, and it's all right. In addition to Final Fantasy 16 and Hi-Fi Rush, are also Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom and Alan Wake 2,
which is a great lineup of score and music.
Yeah, it's a great lineup. It's not a perfect lineup, because without Pizza Tower, we're not talking about all the best scores of the year. But yeah, I think this is Final Fantasy's category, because Final Fantasy is not winning RPG. I think Final Fantasy, and it won't have its own video, right? But we'll keep rated in this point in all of the nominee videos. But score and performance are basically locked down for Final Fantasy 16.
And we can move on to performance. The nominees, who are Idris Elba as Solomon Reed in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, Melanie Libbert as Saga Anderson in Alan Wake 2, Yuri Lowenthal as Peter Parker in Miles Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Cameron Monaghan as Cal Kestis in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Neil Newbin as Asterion in Baldur's Gate 3, and Ben Starr as Clive Rossfield in Final Fantasy 16. Now, I never met Asterion. I had like 4 different characters on my team. I liked all their characters. Frankly, I'm very much a storytelling guy, and when I think about why this could win narrative, it comes to me to the characters first and foremost. People have talked a pretty mean game about how the moment-to-moment storytelling of Baldur's Gate 3 is really the narrative of it, while the overarching narrative of the larger lore and stuff is kind of whatever and frankly kind of weak. But in the character writing, performances, and storytelling of those, I thought it was fantastic. And that's what really compelled me to play as much of the game as I did, is I found Karlach to be an interesting character. She has this, I'm using this performance category to talk about characters, but Karlach has this, she just escaped from hell, so she has this heart that needs to be fed metal ingots to like keep running, but it makes her body run hot, so she can't physically touch anyone, so she can't build relationships. I'm like, that's such a phenomenal character idea and archetype that I haven't really heard from before. And I actually don't know Asterion's character or his archetype or his background or anything. But from the people that I did meet, I thought they were all fantastic and very well voice acted and well animated and stuff. And so Larian obviously knows how to direct their actors, how to create compelling characters. And I'm sure Asterion is another one of those that is handled very, very well. But he also has no chance of winning this, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it before. I mean, Ben Starr is friends with everybody. It's a great performance. He's a very charismatic guy. He's going to win. He won the Golden Joystick, so it'll be no different here. But
next up?
Interesting category here. Best community support nominees being Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Destiny 2, Final Fantasy 14, and No Man's Sky. I think that this is a terrible category.
Okay. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, I mean,
this is the only time we're actually talking about this, because it's the only Game of the Year nominated for this category.
Yeah, I have a. Let me actually pull up the game awards, the game
Sure.
awards site, and I'm gonna go to the category, and I just want to read the little
Okay, sure.
blurb about
Best community support.
view all categories. Best community support. Recognizing a game for outstanding community support, transparency, and responsiveness, inclusive of social media activity and game updates / patches.
Why do you think this is stupid?
Well, Destiny 2 has been widely panned for its involvement in this category. And that obviously the community is extremely unhappy with the game, and Bungie seems to be unhappy with their financial results and also their comms team because they fired all of them. So as they're talking about Undefining Duke is a pretty clear example of not the right people nominating games for this category. And I also think that it's just really strange to be putting two big single-player RPGs in Baldur's Gate and Cyberpunk up against three games that are actually persistent and actually have a more robust community presence in the way that you consider online game communities.
I do agree with that, but I do actually think that Baldur's Gate 3 being nominated here is a pretty inspired choice, because there's one very clear example of this that you mentioned earlier. This game went into early access 3 years ago, and continually received feedback and support and was developed alongside its community to turn into the great game that it was today.
Fair enough.
That is something that Larian was obviously so good at that it led them to making a game that was Game of the Year worthy. And that responsiveness and the idea of putting something out into open beta and playtesting it with other people and fixing things so that the final project is as good as it can be. And frankly, that's probably a very large part of why it turned out as good as it did. I think that is not the traditional kind of community support that is a live service game, which is a reason why I think this category is important to have, is that is an important part of the video game ecosystem nowadays. Sure. But something that does get overlooked is that beta testing, is that open beta community support. Something like Hades a few years ago could have easily been nominated in a category like this, because games like Hades and Baldur's Gate 3 are developed alongside their community, the hardcore players that are really into it and playing it even before it's fully released, and working alongside it. Yeah, I think that is. I think it's a very inspired choice for nominee here.
That's fair. I'm not gonna weigh in on this category, frankly, because
no, I don't know. I don't think it's gonna win necessarily, but I think it's an interesting choice.
No, I think you make a good case, and it's a case I hadn't considered. I just ultimately I don't want to be a TGA voter here and weigh in on something I don't understand. Even though I did do that in my personal votes, but my personal votes are really just me trying to get things I like to be set on stage by Jeff Keighley. So objectives are a little bit different there. Stakes are a little bit lower. I don't have any knowledge to give an actual analytical answer to this.
The next up is Best Role-Playing Game. Nominees being Baldur's Gate 3, Final Fantasy 16, Lights of P, Sea of Stars, and Starfield. Now, this is actually the most locked category of the night. No chance in shit Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't win. There's a couple nominees in here that people would contend are iffy, if they're even role-playing games. And I would say, from a traditional point of view, Baldur's Gate 3 in its flexibility of combat and choice splintering and choosing dialogue options, and frankly, the fact that it's a top-down literally Dungeons and Dragons inspired game. This is maybe the role-playing game of role-playing games, and so this is an easy win here.
I have a question for you, and this might not be a phenomenon large enough to matter, but do you think that people saying, "Yep, okay, I'm casting my vote for Baldur's Gate for Game of the Year. It's gonna win Game of the Year." Final Fantasy, Starfield, Sea of Stars are in maybe some other categories, but their category is RPG. Do you think that there is enough people saying, "Hey, look, I want Starfield to get an award," or "Hey, look, Sea of Stars is amazing.
I don't think there's enough.
I'm going to cast my vote here because it's one of the games."
I think it's possible, but I think it's an unlikely scenario. That we'll have to relitigate once the winners actually happen. But I don't think you're in any contest. It's just like 95% going to win this category. Finally, this is the last category, Best Multiplayer Game, Baldur's Gate 3. Nominees being Baldur's Gate 3, Diablo 4, Party Animal, Street Fighter 6, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Very interesting category here in terms of each of these offering something very different in terms of what multiplayer can mean. Baldur's Gate 3, I think, is a really interesting one, because from what I know of its multiplayer, especially the Well, actually, no, it only has local multiplayer. The local multiplayer is fascinating in that it's like drop in, drop out co-op, but each person has like a full ass character on the same console. And I've watched my friend Joe and his girlfriend play a little bit of it, and they played a ton of it that way, and apparently works really well. And they're bringing a split screen co-op, traditional split screen co-op, to a game that you would not expect to even the dev team to have even considered that. So this is a really, really cool thing that it was nominated for best multiplayer, even though in a traditional sense, it's only 2 people playing. That is, multiplayer is an aspect of this, but it's certainly a smaller aspect than a lot of other games released this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's novel. I think it's novel in the same way that Mario Wonder getting nominated is novel. But I just don't think that the novelty of what Mario Wonder does online or the novelty of what Baldur's Gate does in local multiplayer holds even a candle to the scope of the multiplayer endeavor that is particularly Street Fighter, which I think is going to win this category 100%. To me, it's not even a competition. Okay, cool. So you got a good local multiplayer suite of options in Baldur's Gate. That's awesome. Now look at all the shit you can do in Street Fighter. I just
look at the funny guys that people make and they wander around the lobby. That's awesome.
I just saw somebody make Donkey Kong. It was on Twitter today.
That's nuts.
Which is pretty funny. Yeah, but even if you go beyond that, I mean, all the great options you have for local play, the various ways you can play online. It's not a contest here. So probably one of the only, in addition to performance, probably the only categories that Baldur's Gate's definitely not winning.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
You would say?
Yeah.
So,
but that is all 8 categories that Baldur's Gate has been nominated for. I think we talked about, this is the longest we've ever talked about a game that barely either of us had played. But it is maybe the most interesting story of this year in terms of game development and popularity and shaping the industry for the future. So I'm very glad we got a chance to talk about it, and we will be back for more videos of this ilk, because there are 4. Count them 4. More nominees for us to talk about.